Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is the one and only Laura.
Thank you, Chris. And I have to say, today's story is the kind that makes me want to pull out a giant map and start pushing little data center pieces around like a war game board.
That is quite an image to open with, so let's set the table for everyone listening before we get into the strategy and the drama behind this enormous announcement.
Absolutely. So here's the headline. Bloomberg reported on June 9th that China is preparing a plan to spend roughly 2 trillion yuan, which is about $295 billion over the next, say, 5 years, building a nationwide network of artificial intelligence data centers.
$295 billion is a number so large that it almost loses meaning. So help me understand what that money is actually supposed to buy and who is in charge of spending it.
The blueprint is being drafted by the National Development and Reform Commission, which is essentially Beijing's central economic planning agency, and the goal is to knit together all of China's scattered computing facilities into one single interconnected national grid by 2028.
So this is not just building new data centers from scratch. It is more like building a power grid for intelligence, where compute can flow around the country the way electricity flows between cities today.
That is exactly the right metaphor, and it is one Beijing itself loves to use. They have talked for years about computing power as a utility, something you meter and ship across provinces, and this plan finally puts serious national money behind that east to west compute vision.
And who actually runs all this infrastructure once it gets built? Because I'm guessing it is not a bunch of scrappy startups winning these contracts in an open bidding war.
You guessed correctly, my friend. The bulk of these data centers will be operated by the big state-owned telecom giants, China Mobile and China Telecom, which tells you everything about how centralized and state-directed this whole effort is going to be from day one.
Okay, but here's where I think the story gets genuinely spicy, because the most aggressive part of this plan is not the dollar figure at all. It is the rule about whose chips are allowed inside these buildings.
Oh, it is absolutely the chip mandate that makes this a global story. The blueprint requires that local suppliers, led by Huawei, provide at least 80% of the core technology, including the AI accelerator chips themselves, which effectively squeezes NVIDIA and AMD out of the entire build-out.
80% domestic is a staggering requirement when you consider that just a couple of years ago, basically every serious AI lab on the planet, Chinese ones included, was desperate to get its hands on NVIDIA hardware by any means available.
Right, and the trend line here has been building for a while. Back in November, state-funded projects in China were barred from foreign accelerators entirely, and there were reports that construction projects less than 30% complete were actually told to rip out NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel parts they had already installed.
Wait, hold on. They were told to physically remove chips that were already racked and ready to go? That sounds incredibly expensive and wasteful. So walk me through why any planner would willingly take that kind of hit.
It sounds irrational until you look at it through the lens of supply chain security rather than economics. Beijing watched Washington tighten export controls year after year, starting with the October 2022 rules that banned anything at or above the A100 class of chip, and concluded that any American silicon and critical infrastructure is a vulnerability that can be switched off remotely by a future sanctions decision.
So the calculation is essentially that paying a painful short-term price in performance and money is worth it to guarantee that no foreign government can ever pull the plug on your national intelligence infrastructure.
Precisely. And this is the part Western analysts keep underestimating, in my opinion. This is not a commercial decision. It is a sovereignty decision. And sovereignty decisions get measured in decades, not in quarterly earnings calls or in benchmark comparisons against the latest Blackwell successor.
Let's talk about Huawei then. Because if you are going to hand one company the keys to an 80% domestic mandate, you had better be confident that company can actually deliver the silicon at the volume and quality this plan demands.
And that is the trillion yuan question, quite literally. Huawei shipped roughly 812,000 AI chips last year, and it is projecting around $12 billion in processor revenue for 2026. But reporting suggests its own supply chain has genuinely struggled to sustain even that pace.
That seems like a real problem because 812,000 chips sounds like a lot until you remember that American hyperscalers are deploying millions of accelerators a year. And the gap in manufacturing capability does not close just because a planning commission writes an ambitious document.
Exactly. And the bottleneck is not design talent, it is fabrication. Without access to the most advanced extreme ultraviolet lithography tools, Chinese fabs are stuck producing chips a generation or two behind, with lower yields, which means every accelerator costs more energy and more silicon to deliver less performance than its American counterpart.
So play devil's advocate with me for a second, because skeptics would say this whole plan is a recipe for building the world's largest collection of mediocre data centers, filled wall to wall with chips that nobody outside China would choose to buy on the open market.
That is a fair critique, and honestly, some of it lands, but I would push back on the framing in one important way. China does not need to win the frontier model race chip for chip. It needs enough aggregate compute to deploy good enough models across its entire economy. And aggregate is exactly what a national grid delivers.
That distinction feels important. So unpack it a little more. Because I think a lot of people assume the only race that matters is whoever trains the single smartest model on the planet first.
So think of it this way. The frontier race is about peak performance. One lab, one giant cluster, one record-breaking training run. But the diffusion race is about how fast AI actually soaks into factories, hospitals, logistics networks, and government services. And that race is one with cheap, abundant, reliable inference capacity spread everywhere.
And that is where the name of their national strategy comes in, right? This whole build-out is explicitly designed to serve the policy Beijing calls AI+, which always struck me as a deliberately bland name for a very ambitious idea.
It is a wonderfully bureaucratic branding for something sweeping, yes. AI Plus is the directive to proliferate artificial intelligence through every sector of the Chinese economy, the way electrification touched everything a century ago. And a national compute grid is the physical backbone that makes that kind of universal deployment even theoretically possible.
Now let's put the spending in context, because $295 billion over 5 years sounds colossal. But the American side of this ledger is putting up numbers that honestly made me double-check my notes when I first read them.
Your notes are correct, and the comparison is wild. American companies led by Meta, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon are setting aside roughly $725 billion for AI infrastructure this year alone, and Meta by itself has guided to between $125 and $145 billion in capital expenditure for 2026.
So the entire 5-year Chinese state plan is smaller than what corporate America intends to spend in a single year, which raises the obvious question of whether Beijing is bringing a knife to an artillery duel here.
On raw dollars, sure, but I would be careful with that conclusion for 3 reasons. First, construction and energy are dramatically cheaper in China. Second, this 2 trillion yuan is state seed money that provinces and state-owned enterprises will multiply several times over. And third, China is adding electricity generation capacity at a pace the United States simply cannot match right now.
The energy point deserves more attention, because everyone in the American AAI world spends their days complaining about interconnection queues, transformer shortages, and utilities that need 7 years to approve a new transmission line for a hungry data center campus.
Meanwhile, China added more power generation capacity last year than most countries possess in total, across coal, solar, hydro, and nuclear. And when your binding constraint is electrons rather than dollars, central planning is annoyingly good at delivering electrons exactly where the plan says they should go.
Okay, so let's game out the consequences for the companies caught in the middle of this, starting with NVIDIA. Because being structurally locked out of the second largest AI market on Earth seems like it should matter to the most valuable company in the world.
It matters, though maybe less than you would think at this exact moment. NVIDIA's problem today is that demand everywhere else still exceeds supply, so every chip not sold in China finds a buyer elsewhere within minutes. The real cost is long-term, because losing China means losing an entire continent-sized market where developers might have built on its software ecosystem for decades.
That software point is underrated, because NVIDIA's real moat was never just the silicon. It was the fact that an entire generation of AI engineers everywhere learned to think in its programming framework before they learned anything else.
And now an entire generation of Chinese engineers will learn on Huawei's stack instead, which means by 2030, you could have 2 parallel AI software universes, each with its own tooling, its own optimizations, and its own gravitational pull on the countries that buy infrastructure from each block.
That brings up the third-party angle, because the rest of the world, from Indonesia to Brazil to Saudi Arabia, is shopping for AI infrastructure right now. And they suddenly have 2 very different catalogs to order from.
This is the part of the story I find most consequential, honestly. China has a long track record of exporting state-subsidized infrastructure through the Belt and Road Playbook, and a mature, debugged, vertically integrated AI stack running at national scale becomes an extremely compelling export product for any government that finds American technology politically complicated or simply too expensive.
So the data center grid is also a showroom, essentially. China proves the full domestic stack works at home, then sells the package abroad, the same way it did with high-speed rail and telecom equipment over the last 2 decades.
Exactly, and remember, the showroom argument cuts both ways. If the grid underdelivers, if those domestic chips choke on real workloads, or the interconnection turns out to be more press release than performance, then the failure is also extremely public, and buyers around the world will draw their conclusions just as quickly.
Let me raise the uncomfortable historical comparison, because China has done gigantic centrally planned technology pushes before, and the results have ranged from genuine triumph in high-speed rail to spectacular waste in some of the semiconductor subsidy programs that produce fraud instead of fabs.
That is the honest caveat, and even Chinese state media has acknowledged that the first wave of AI data center construction produced facilities sitting partly idle, built in remote provinces for subsidy reasons, rather than because any customer actually needed compute there. The new plan is partly a correction, forcing those scattered sites into one coherent network instead of letting every province build its own vanity cluster.
So in a strange way, this announcement is an admission of past failure, as much as a declaration of future ambition, which is not how most of the breathless headlines have framed it this week.
Right, and that nuance matters for forecasting. The question is not whether China can pour concrete. It obviously can. The question is whether unifying the grid and standardizing on domestic silicon fixes the utilization problem, or just gives the inefficiency a fancier national architecture diagram to hide behind.
Let's bring this home for our listeners, because most of them are not running foreign ministries. They are running businesses, building products, and trying to figure out what a bifurcating global AI infrastructure actually means for their planning over the next few years.
The practical takeaway is that the AI world is splitting into 2 technology stacks, and that split will eventually show up in everything from cloud pricing and chip availability to which AI products are even legal to deploy in which markets. So any company operating internationally should start mapping which side of that line its suppliers, customers, and data centers sit on.
And there is a supply chain echo too, because if China consumes more of its own chip-making inputs, and the West keeps onshoring fabs at full subsidy speed, the components, the talent, and even the electricians who wire these buildings all get more scarce and more expensive for everybody at once.
Which is why I keep telling people that the most important AI metric to watch through 2027 is not benchmark scores, it is gigawatts and wafer starts, because the bottleneck has moved from clever algorithms to physical industrial capacity. And physical capacity is exactly the game this Chinese plan is built to play.
So give me your prediction before we wrap, because you always have one. 5 years from now, when this plan hits its 2028 grid deadline and beyond, does it look like high-speed rail, or does it look like those ghost semiconductor fabs?
My honest bet is somewhere in between, leaning toward rail. I think the grid gets built, the chips remain a generation behind, and yet it still succeeds strategically, because good enough compute everywhere, owned entirely by yourself, beats brilliant compute you can lose to a sanctions order, at least in the eyes of the people writing 2 trillion yuan checks.
That is a characteristically sharp place to land, and I suspect we will be revisiting this story many times as the construction crews and the chip fabs try to keep up with the planning documents.
No doubt about it, and to everyone listening, keep an eye on those quiet provincial announcements about new computing hubs, because that is where you will see whether this grand blueprint is actually turning into steel, silicon, and electricity.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.